Welcome back, everybody, to Module 3 of Teaching Academic Skills course titled Reinforcement and Prompting. The content of these slides was compiled by myself, Dr. Leslie Neely, and Dr. Catherine Hoffman. This work was supported in whole or part by a grant from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, THECB. The opinions and conclusions expressed in this document are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the opinions or policy of the THECB. So the following questions are answered in this module. What are the ABCs of ABA? What is reinforcement? What is prompting? And how can we encourage correct responding? Following this module, you will complete an activity where you will demonstrate your skills in prompting and reinforcement to begin teaching new skills to your child. So the basics of ABA can be thought of as the ABCs. Any learning situation can be broken down into three parts. A, or the antecedent, is at the beginning of the skill. This encompasses what happens before the behavior begins. B stands for behavior and represents what the learner does in response to A. C stands for the consequence or what follows the behavior. So let's look at a concrete example. A dad says, "Touch your nose." This would be considered the antecedent. Antecedents often include instructions or specific environmental conditions. The behavior following this antecedent is that his daughter touches her nose. And then following that behavior, the dad delivers a consequence. In this example, he says, "Good job." Notice that consequence here is a positive experience. In ABA, consequence simply means what happens after the behavior. It does not necessarily mean something that is negative. If the consequence is one that is likely to increase the future likelihood of a behavior, then the consequence is called a reinforcer. In this example, on the first trial, the father follows the behavior with "good job." Sometime later, the dad says, "Touch your nose." If the child is more likely to respond by touching her nose on this subsequent trial, then dad saying "good job" in the previous trial is considered a reinforcer and can be used again to further increase the likelihood that the child will respond correctly. However, if on the second trial the nose touching behavior decreases, then dad saying "good job" in the first trial is not an effective reinforcer. For children with special learning needs, oftentimes some of the more natural consequences, such as praise, cannot be assumed to be reinforcing. Instead, it is wise to use a preference assessment to understand better what motivates each specific learner. For instance, if popcorn was determined to be a high preferred item, then in teaching his daughter to touch her nose, dad might also add a preferred item in addition to the praise. Then in subsequent trials, if the behavior increases, praise plus the popcorn can be considered an effective reinforcer. Following the behavior with praise and popcorn will likely increase the behavior in the future trials. In addition, pairing with praise with a good consequence, popcorn, will help praise alone become more motivating in the future. So in summary, reinforcement is any consequence that follows a behavior and makes that behavior more likely to occur in the future. So the key to teaching any new skill to your child is to follow the behavior with a reinforcer and thus increase the likelihood that it will occur in the future. So what happens if your child does not do the behavior? How can I reinforce it? How do I reinforce behaviors that have not been learned and do not occur? So that's a good question. The child must do the behavior, at least some form of the behavior, before the behavior can be reinforced. So this is where prompting comes in. A prompt is a hint or cue added to the environment to make it more likely that a learner will respond correctly. So therefore we can reinforce that response. A prompt occurs after the instruction, or the antecedent, and before any behavior occurs. So there are infinite ways to prompt a learner. Some examples of prompting include giving verbal hints, pointing to the correct answer, or physically guiding the learner to do something correctly. To become proficient at prompting, it is important to understand the different types of prompts that can be delivered. So above is a list of general categories of prompts. Prompts can include simple gestures, modeling of a correct answer, verbal cues, or physically aiding the child in responding. The above list is just a start, as within each category, there are more or less intrusive ways for each prompt. For example, within the category of verbal prompting, you can deliver a full verbal prompt where you give the full answer, a partial verbal prompt where you give some of the words, or a mnemonic prompt where you simply deliver the very first sound of the answer. For example, if you are trying to teach your child to say cow, when you present them with a picture of a cow, you might start with a full verbal prompt, show them the picture of the cow, and then say cow, or you might only provide a partial verbal prompt, such as k. What type of prompting you will use with your learner will be something you discuss with your BCBA-D. Another consideration is that each learner may respond differently to the different prompts. For instance, for a learner that can readily imitate what you are doing, a modeling prompt might be useful. If your learner has difficulty imitating your actions, then a physical prompt might be more appropriate. Learning which prompt to deliver and when to move on to a lower prompt is probably one of the most important pieces of teaching and learning. It is also one that requires practice. Really great teachers have mastered this art with years of training, but they did not start out as masters. Within the scope of this sequence, it may be helpful to simply pick one or two types of prompts to practice. Then as you gain mastery and learn how your child responds, you can continue to develop this skill within the additional resources. So how do we encourage correct responding when we present the instruction? We go back to the ABCs. So first, let's look at what happens before the behavior or the antecedent. The first thing you'll do is present your instruction. In this situation, Dad says, touch your nose. However, before Dad presents the instruction, touch your nose, he must first secure his learner's attention. So there are a couple of tips for securing attention. The first is to set up the motivation. Have your learner pick a favorite item to work for using the paired choice or forced choice preferences assessment you learned in the previous module. Then set the item aside in a place that's in sight but out of reach. Make sure the learning area is clear from distraction, and wait for your child to pay attention to you before presenting the instruction. Depending on your learner, you might try calling their name or telling them eyes on me. However, you should refrain from snapping or other actions such as banging on the table. Please note you might actually have to prompt the learner's eyes on you or their hands down, and we call this attending. So you might actually have to work on attending prior to working on the academic skill. So once you have your learner's attention, present task items on the table equally spaced and do not touch the items after you have put them down. When you say the instruction, you use clear and concise phrases. For example, if you're teaching an early learner, you might say touch the horse instead of where is the tiny little horse. And make sure to use the correct word, for example, horse versus horsey. So once you have your learner's attention, present clear and concise instructions and a prompt if necessary. So then your child performs the behavior and you provide the reinforcement. the most important part is the reinforcement. So how can we use reinforcement and prompting to encourage appropriate responding? One tool you can use to speed up learning is to adjust the amount of reinforcement based on your learner's need for prompts. This technique is called differential reinforcement. If your learner responds with a lower level of prompting, then you want to deliver a higher level of reinforcement. For example, if you were teaching Sarah her name and her preferred item was watching a favorite video, then you might deliver a lower amount of time on the video with her preferred item if she required a full verbal prompt. However, if she only required a partial verbal prompt, you might give her even more time on the video. Furthermore, if she only required you to deliver the first sound of her name, then you might deliver even more reinforcement, 1 minute on the video. So the amount of reinforcement can be manipulated with all types of reinforcement. If it is access to attention, then you can vary the quality of attention. So perhaps you might reserve tickles and laughs for when your learner performs at a lower level prompt, and then simply deliver a nice job when your learner requires a higher level prompt. If the reinforcer is time with the preferred item, then you might manipulate the amount of time that is granted. And if your learner is motivated by edibles, then you might vary the amount of edibles given. So here are some tips on differential reinforcement. It is important to remember that if the learner's first time ever doing the response, you may want to provide lots of reinforcement, even for a response that is fully prompted. Once they have shown that they can answer reliably when fully prompted, then you can reduce the amount of reinforcement at each level. So remember that each learner is different. Knowing your learner or what she prefers and what might be more reinforcing for one learner, for example, tickles, may not be reinforcing at all for the other learner. And finally, learning is not always linear. If your learner backtracks, it's okay. If the learner continues to require more assistance or higher prompts and is not making progress over a number of sessions, then we might need to troubleshoot what is happening. And we will cover this in the next module. So learning how to implement prompting and fading out those prompts takes practice. It is good to start with one skill at a time and focus on learning the process correctly. And then we can start applying this skill to other situations. Remember that the process is not always linear. Do not get frustrated if your learner backtracks to more assistance or a higher level prompt than the day before. If it is a pattern, you can always ask for help. Often this process has to be tweaked to the specific learner, and that's something that your BCBA can help with. Practicing the skill every day will yield better results. Find a way to integrate this into your routine and do it daily for best results for you and your learner. And remember to take data on the behavior. First, this will just be motivating to see the progress of your learner and will also be helpful for the BCBA for you guys to discuss if you run into road bumps. And most importantly, don't forget the reinforcement. If a preferred item is no longer motivating for your learner, you will need to reassess preference and try something new. So this week, we will practice prompting and reinforcement by making a video of yourself teaching the target skill to your child. Please go to the Eli Atomy webpage for more detailed information on this assignment. So thank you for your attention. Below the next couple of slides is the figure list and the references.